College football nerds 2025 Alabama preview. We're talking Crimson Tide. I'm in a new location, a little more like YouTube guy and a little less college football guy, but that's okay. This is where I work, so I also want it to feel cool for me. So we get to see what I like. I got Josh with me, and he's going to talk Alabama football like we always do. Welcome back. We haven't seen you in a while. We do this every offseason. We go do our big kid job thing. But if we're talking to you, then that means college football is pretty close. We're excited about that. We'll remind everybody, if you haven't liked and subscribed by now, I don't even know what to say because y'all have been with us for a decade now. And if you haven't followed us on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, you need to follow us there because we got some smart ass things to say there too. All right, Josh, 2024 was not really what Alabama fans were accustomed to at the end of the year. And we're going to get into quarterback a little bit. I've got, we've got our thoughts there that are pretty clear, have been made clear for a couple of years now, but I want to get into that. But I want people, maybe even a retread for the Alabama fans that don't fully understand what DeBoer walked into. I want to recontextualize the start of that season and maybe why it turned out the way it did and why it was maybe better than people might have thought. All people see on the surface is what Saban had done his whole career at Alabama and what DeBoer did his first year. But after Washington played in the national championship game, from that team, he had to quickly scramble and become the Alabama head coach and start immediately recruiting because if people don't remember, when your head coach leaves, that opens yourself and only yourself up to be poached through the portal. So he had to recruit all the guys he could to stay. Alabama already lost a ton of depth on that team, especially in the secondary. He lost his offensive line coach. He had been with him for a while. He lost Grubb, his offensive coordinator, who's been in there for a while, and had to scramble to replace these guys. And one of whom he replaced with was Sheridan, who didn't have extensive play caller knowledge. Josh, talk a little bit about how hard the situation was that DeBoer walked into, and whether or not you think he did maybe as bad as people think.
I don't think there's any doubt that it was a difficult situation, right? It's always hard for a coach trying to put new schemes in defensively and offensively in the same year. You combine it with the fact that they lose 20-something players to transfers. They had a lot of high-quality players that left in the draft that year. And, to top it all off, because you had a limited roster recruiting and whatnot, there's probably only so much they could really do, frankly, to push the players in the offseason because they couldn't afford to lose them. And let's, Daniel, for some perspective on this, let's not forget about what they lost out of last year, right? They had 3 first-round draft picks, Terrion Arnold, Dallas Turner, J.C. Latham. Overall, they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 draft picks in that draft. This past year, they had 7. They had 2 first-rounders, a third-rounder, 6th-rounder, 2 fourths, and a 5th. Only 3 guys that went in the first 3 rounds of the draft. They lost more talent to the draft than DeBoer got back in terms of senior talent. They had a ton of guys transfer, including guys that were NFL caliber players themselves. They had in the secondary no choice really but to start a true freshman somewhere. I mean, they had 3 players in Xavier Brown, Mbakwe, and Mincy that were all true freshmen having to play major roles at different points in the season. Keon Sabb got hurt. Something I heard from a couple of people around the program, they were asking whether or not, DeBoer was happy or not happy with, secondary players and, what's the feeling within the program about the secondary play and defensive play. And sort of the word that came out of the program was, you guys don't understand how thin we are and how young we are. I mean, you don't want to be in a position where you're playing freshmen because you have no other real option, and that's where Alabama was last season. They had some good players in the front 7. They gelled. They had new starters and whatnot. Obviously, Campbell became a star for them. I think he had to figure things out on the mental scheme side. Early in the year, they certainly had a lot of issues where they weren't multiple enough. I know The film guy, who's a friend of our channel we talk to sometimes, has pointed out they double mug a lot with a single safety. I don't think they had a lot of choice because I don't think they had a very good understanding of scheme. And there's a big difference between them late in the year and early in the year because of that, and what they were able to do from a multiples perspective. Given all these changes, given all the turnover, you don't want to be installing a brand new scheme with a lot of wrinkles, relying heavily on transfers and true freshmen to be able to execute that scheme, none of whom have run it before. And so I think you've got to give a lot of credit for that. You've got to give credit for the fact that the offensive, situation with Milroe and whatnot, love him or hate him, I don't think they had a lot of choice in how that was going to operate. And when you look at Daniel, some of the games that went south, I mean, the Vanderbilt was the big game. They win the Georgia game in a huge game at home. It was a game that everybody thought was probably going to determine who was going to be the SEC champion at the time. Then they got to play on the road at Vanderbilt. We're obviously not properly prepared. But I think something that flew under the radar, I believe their nickel corner got hurt in that game. So they're playing at times like either two true freshmen or bouncing off some transfers that weren't very good. Clearly didn't have this team together. That was a game where 3 times in that game, it's an interesting thing I've talked at the time, Alabama had 9 offensive drives. 3 times their defense gave them the ball and a chance to tie or take the lead. It was after the first drive, like second quarter, and then late in the game. Every one of those times, their offense turned the ball over, leading directly to a Vanderbilt score. It was the pick six that made it, instead of 7-7, 14-0 to start the game. Later on, they had I called it a turnover, but Jalen Milroe on third down threw the ball past the line of scrimmage, which was a loss and down, punted the ball to the Vanderbilt 40 or to their own 45. Vanderbilt drove 45 yards and scored to turn what would have been an Alabama lead into now a 2-score deficit. And then Alabama in the third quarter took a sack where they were trying to drive to take the lead and instead became a 2-score deficit. And I say all that too to say there was just so much inconsistency and so many times where they couldn't get out of their own way. And you can blame DeBoer all you want, but DeBoer doesn't throw interceptions. DeBoer doesn't cause the right tackle to miss a block and the quarterback to miss the fact that he's missed the block and fumble the ball to the other team. Yeah, they don't execute well enough. Yeah, you want to score enough that it doesn't matter. But they just, when it mattered, I think from an execution perspective, they didn't have the pieces. They didn't have the scheme. They weren't consistent enough. And when you put all that together with what DeBoer inherited, I don't blame Kalen DeBoer at all for what happened last year. It's hard for me to do that. Yeah, they probably weren't up as much as they wanted to be, but that was not a team that they could crack the whip and drive because they couldn't afford, again, when you're starting true freshmen by necessity, they couldn't afford a secondary transfer. Just couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford offensive line transfers. This year, they're going to be able to do that. And Daniel, I think you're going to see a very different mentality from them, both because of the pieces they have, the comfortability with the roster, but also, frankly, they know that they could push those players at a level, and I've heard this from a lot of people, that they weren't able to push last year, and they went from 20-something transfers to no one transferring out during spring ball. And I think you're going to just see a very, very different team, at least from a cultural perspective, as a result of that.
Yeah, and I think that there's a couple of things that do speak to either just the hurried nature of coaching or things that you can maybe lay at their feet that I don't think you would see in a normal year. But apparently in the Vanderbilt game, that defense was tipping what they were doing, and Vanderbilt was able to key off of it. And for a lot of the season last year, I don't think it got caught on until late in the year, but Milroe was tipping run versus pass based on how he was lined up, his foot alignment at the snap. So little stuff like that certainly has to get cleaned up. But in general, this year is the reverse of last year, where you're bringing in continuity with the coaching staff. For all of the talk about anything about Alabama this year, the fact that Grubb is coming back to this staff is the biggest news for Alabama that could possibly take place, because part of that not being able to push players hard was Sheridan being a first-time play caller at a program of this scale with expectations of this scale of Alabama. He hadn't given Jalen Milroe the business when he screws up or doing something to help him with his mental issues. That ain't happening. So from that standpoint, from a coaching standpoint, I think they're in a really good place. From a personnel standpoint, to your point, they lost so much that they have not lost this year, and that's a huge thing. And we talked about this in the Texas preview, but when you have a good team, which Alabama was still a good team, they just weren't there to their normal standard. When you have a good team that doesn't get just eviscerated in the draft, that's a really good sign. And I don't think Alabama fans are really accustomed to this because they're always getting fleeced by the NFL draft, fleeced by the transfer portal. Although a lot of the guys that transfer out, other than like Caleb Downs, usually end up sucking. Like half of Florida State's roster is Alabama players, and they didn't do that great. So I think that Alabama fans need to understand and appreciate that from a draft perspective, it says a lot good about who this Alabama team can and probably will be this year, if for no other reason than they recruit at a really high level and they didn't lose a lot of talent last year or coming out of last year. Josh, we talked about this with Arch Manning and Quinn Ewers in our Texas preview. And I'm going to ask you the same question about Ty Simpson and Jalen Milroe. If Ty Simpson comes out and is just absolutely unconscious and plays up to his 5-star billing coming out of high school and just looks like one of the quarterbacks of the previous 4 or 5 that Alabama fans have become accustomed to in this system or at this program, are you going to have some criticism for Kalen DeBoer because he didn't bench a guy, in my opinion, held this Alabama program hostage for 2 years? And I'm just going to say it, like he lost them several games last year just because he had major mental breakdowns. Michigan, second half of Tennessee, all of Oklahoma. Are you going to be critical of DeBoer because he didn't bench Jalen Milroe, or is there something else that's part of your thought process?
Well, the first thing, I'll say the same thing I said in the Texas video. You have to assume the coaches that are watching the practice know what they're looking at. I mean, DeBoer has been coaching for a long time, has one of the best win rates of any head coach in FBS and FCS. I think really the best win rate, if I remember correctly. He didn't get there by being an idiot. And he's coached some guys like Penix who are very good quarterbacks in his career. And so, look, if Simpson comes in and sets the world on fire, I mean, my first assumption, and the assumption you have to take, is he wasn't there last year. And there was some tape at one point. He did play a little bit of backups, and I remember it was like FCS game, Mercer game or something I flipped to. I remember looking at YouTube video trying to get some film on Simpson, and I actually did not think the video was very good of him. He was scrambling, unsure in the pocket, had great protection because they're playing an FCS team, and he's running out of the pocket trying to make a play, throwing from the outside, and really he just needed to sit there and read his keys and go. He seemed a little out of control, and he played a couple years ago in a USF game, which is a little similar, took forever to throw from the pocket. It just didn't seem like he was as composed as he needed to be. So the first thing I'll say is you should assume that even if he does really well, yeah, maybe he had the tools, but he didn't have it all together otherwise. And Milroe had a lot of composure in terms of commanding the team for the most part. But, you know, I will agree with you, Daniel. Jalen Milroe had some real come-aparts. And that's a difference to me between him and Ewers, is there were times where Ewers played poorly, but especially last year, they were still winning. They were still moving the ball. It wasn't costing his team. He wasn't throwing, you know, he threw 2 interceptions twice on the season. One of them, one was against Georgia. The other one, actually, interestingly enough, was in Vanderbilt, but he still threw 3 touchdowns that game. Jalen Milroe turned the ball over a lot, and he had games where he was very ineffective. And so if Milroe, I mean, when you look back at him and, like, you know, the Oklahoma game, no touchdowns, 3 interceptions. And look, I'll give him 1 to 2 touchdowns because he had one certainly 3 that got called back. Though I will say that was on 4th down after he missed an open receiver, I think, on the 2 prior downs, including a bad overthrow that set up that 4th down throw to Williams. At some point, if Ty Simpson was a guy that was capable of playing, you kind of think maybe they should have benched Milroe and given him a shot because, you know, it's a harsh thing to say, but just where he was at in that moment, and maybe it was just Milroe needing to take a breather. There were a couple games, second half of Tennessee, Again, after the interceptions, Oklahoma, even the Auburn game, certainly the Michigan game, where he just came unglued. And Spurrier took a lot of great quarterbacks and put them on the bench and let them cool off and put a backup in to good effect. And there are times maybe they should have done that. But look, Daniel, we don't know if Ty Simpson's going to be very good. If he is good, we don't know what he really looked like last year, and maybe he was just totally not ready. It does a lot for a quarterback to be the guy and go through spring as the guy and go through all those 7-on-7 drills you do on your own time with the receivers all summer as the guy and know you're going to be in command. And again, there's a huge dynamic with all the roster turnover that Jalen Milroe was a guy that was a glue guy for that team and those players coming back. And maybe that was something the staff felt like they needed. But I do think there's something to be said that if Simpson ends up being a very, very good quarterback for Alabama, it is impossible not to look back at that season and say, if you had pulled him in the Tennessee game, which you lost anyway, maybe you win that game, maybe you don't. But if you win that game, maybe you do beat Oklahoma, who offensively scored 10 points in that game of their own accord. Maybe that is something that would have given you a chance to win. But it's all hypothetical, Daniel. And my opinion on Jalen Milroe. I think he has a lot of little things he's going to work on. I think he has all the tools on the planet. I think his ceiling is extremely high. He had one of the longest times to throw in football. I think he created an offense like we saw in the LSU game, which I'll say LSU struggled with every running quarterback they faced. South Carolina, Texas A&M also lit them up. But when he's on, he can be phenomenal. He's just such a uniquely hard guy to evaluate because from a processing, and I don't think it's an understanding the offense perspective. I think it's a composure processing perspective, how fast your mind goes. In some ways, almost like the opposite of Jalen Hurts, interestingly enough. It just never clicked. And I think the staff was waiting for that to happen. Even in those games, Daniel, you named, there were moments, I remember like the Tennessee game and I think the Oklahoma game, right, when they threw the pass to Williams. It looked like maybe the light was coming back on and he was going to take it. And so you could understand why they wanted to extend him. But certainly, that long discussion aside, I think the reason for having that discussion is that Jalen Milroe was a huge factor while they were hot and cold last year. He did 100% play poorly in the second half of the season. He's still a guy that gave him a chance to win against Vanderbilt, even with a couple turnovers thrown in. And I think the biggest thing for Alabama, and maybe this is where we go, if they just have solid play at the quarterback position, everywhere else in the field, they have a lot more answers than a lot of the other teams we've looked at. They have more returning talent offensively and defensively than more teams. They have more consistency than more teams. I went back and looked at the last 15 years of the draft. I don't know how far it goes back. This was the fewest number of team players they've had drafted. And again, that's not on DeBoer. That's really on Saban and what came back that DeBoer inherited. They've got every tool they need with just consistent play across the board to be a successful program this year.
So you said in our Ohio State preview that Ohio State's got the best wide receiver room in the country. And I would say that Ohio State might have the best future pros wide receiver room in the country in terms of just pure talent and athleticism. But with the additions Alabama's made in the offseason and Jeremy Bernard coming back, Ryan Williams coming back, I would say for a set of dudes that I want to break a quarterback in and win with, I know that's a silly intangible, I'd probably take Alabama's wide receiver room over any in the country. Everyone is overlooking the fact that it's very possible that Jeremy Bernard is going to be the number 3 wide receiver on this team this year. And he's great. He's really good. I don't think we got to see a lot as near the potential that this unit has because of the limitations last year. And I think what you're going to see is a consistent intermediate passing game is going to open up the rest of the offense, including the running game. I'm super high on GM. I said at some point last year that I thought he was the best running back in the country. I just think he hasn't had the chance to really go because teams were able to load the box last year and completely take the run off the board. To your point about Ty Simpson, I saw the same film. I had similar takeaways in terms of he wasn't ready. But I had this theory including the 2 years ago USF game, I think because Ty wasn't the guy, he was always working so hard. You know, I hate to keep going back to Jalen Milroe, but Jalen Milroe didn't give Alabama enough blowouts against crappy teams to afford Ty a lot of reps. And so I feel like Ty Simpson was going into these games when he did get reps, and he was like so over eager and so excited that he was trying to prove that he is as good as he is with every single play, because he couldn't just take what the offense gave to him, because he might only get 4 or 5 snaps in a game, whereas other backup quarterbacks under normal Alabama standards are getting entire halves to play. So I think there's an opportunity to see a little bit different Ty this year. And that's why I'm a little bit higher on him than I think I would be just from his tape alone. To your other point about DeBoer being a good coach, people forget, and I laugh at these lists that come out. They're like top 20 coaches in college football or whatever. Kalen DeBoer's like always around like 8 or 9 or 10. He is undefeated against Dan Lanning, Kirby Smart, and Steve Sarkisian. I don't know, like, why didn't people not understand and realize this? By the way, he was undefeated against these coaches at Washington with a lot less talent, or at Alabama, where he was fielding a team that was not nearly as seasoned in their coaching staff and familiarity as Kirby Smart's staff was. So when people want to talk about DeBoer because of what just his pure win-loss record was last year, I want to remind them of that. Josh, I want you to talk through the schedule a little bit, because Alabama adds a second Power 4 team out of conference. Schedule looks to me to be even harder than last year. And I think any predictions of what they're going to do in the regular season has to be filtered through just how much harder an Alabama schedule is this year than, say, a Texas or Ohio State, who we just got talking about, and certainly different than a Penn State, who's going to be top 5 by default. Maybe an Indiana is going to be a top 10 by default just because they don't play anybody.
Well, Daniel, I'm going to take that suggestion, and I just have this like burning hatred of talking schedules sometimes, hypothetically. I'm just going to talk about roster, and I'm going to let you talk about the schedule. There are a couple points. One, you mentioned wide receivers. I do agree with you, and I think it is a little crazy when you consider Jalen Hale was a guy that was supposed to be a big contributor for them last year, then got hurt. Rico Scott is a guy that's had a lot of stuff said about him. Latier Brooks is got a tremendous amount of hype. This receiving room, from the people I talk to, people think they could be really, really special. And I also want to quickly mention, though, Daniel, I think 8 returning starters defensively. And I think there are a couple big ones that are going under the radar. One is Justin Jefferson, the linebacker, who rotated with Campbell a lot for them defensively, and that says something about Jefferson. And there were times they pulled Campbell to play Jefferson. That was a guy that was supposed to go to the NFL because his eligibility was up coming out of JUCO. And a flip side of the Pavia JUCO injunction thing, which they just kind of took a 1-year hiatus on. I don't think personally it's going to go anywhere legally, but it's just my personal opinion. They waived those rules for a year. They got Jefferson back unexpectedly. That's a guy that's a phenomenal impact athletic player at linebacker that I think is under the radar. Qua Russaw was a guy that I think was a redshirt freshman last year, started in the first game, got banged up. I don't think he was physically probably ready to play, and he's going to come back. Defensively, they've got multiple 5-star secondary players. Again, they're playing as freshmen, or guys like Damani Jackson that was came out, he had a rib injury to end the year. That is a phenomenal defense. It was one of the better units in our model to end the season, even with their early hiccups. We still had them, top 10 in a lot of defensive statistics. I know, like, total defense per game, they're like 22, but you look like scoring defense, they were 7th. They're going to be a phenomenal defensive unit. So, yeah, I mean, I think they have a hard schedule. They've got, certainly having Georgia on there isn't ideal. Having Tennessee, who I think is going to be probably still at least pretty good, is ideal. South Carolina is not ideal. Oklahoma, I think, will be more dangerous. But it is manageable. And I wanted myself to talk about the defense because I didn't want to leave it aside. That defense is going to give them a high floor, Daniel. And so when you're talking about the schedule discussion, to me, yeah, we can talk about firepower, changes in coaches, wide receiving core could be well, quarterbacks. Defensively, I think they're too good to just get punked. And that means, to me, this schedule ends up being pretty navigable. So I'll let you go on your normal schedule rant, but that's the aside I wanted to jump into.
I like talking hypotheticals. I don't know why other people don't. I think it's a sign of intelligence that you can speak about things that have yet to come and probably won't come to fruition. I think that's pretty good. Alabama was top 10 in scoring defense. They were top 25-ish in rushing defense. They were number 6 in yards per attempt passing defense. That defense was good. And they had a weird game against Vanderbilt, but that defense was good. And you think about all the games they lost, they could have won every one of them just about based on defensive play. The schedule is ridiculous. And look, not all these teams are going to end up being good, but some of them are going to be better than people think they're going to be. And this is why I think it's funny when people are like, they want to throw away a 6-6 team or a 7-5 team. A 6-6 or 7-5 team that is a brand name that recruits really well is still a challenging team you have to play if it's sequenced in a certain way. Alabama has this in the middle of their schedule: Wisconsin at Georgia, Vanderbilt at Missouri, Tennessee at South Carolina, LSU, Oklahoma. That's insane. And other than Georgia, none of those teams are probably going to be top 10. Maybe LSU. Weirdly, some people think they're going to be the best team in the country. They got to figure out how to play defense first. All of those teams have the potential to be good, though. And that's what makes that stretch so hard. I don't know that anybody in the country, maybe Florida, I haven't looked at theirs in depth yet, but I don't think anybody in the country has like 7 name brand teams in a row, Vanderbilt accepted. But Vanderbilt's going to be good, even though they're not a name brand.
Alabama does get a bye week between Wisconsin and Georgia, so it's not quite so bad as that.
But it's still in a row. Like, it's all of those teams. And, yeah, they get a bye week before LSU after they go at South Carolina. But LSU has a bye week before Alabama. Georgia has a bye week before Alabama. Missouri has a bye week before Alabama, which is kind of tough because that's a road game. But all that to say, even if Alabama is better than every team on their schedule, which I think they might be, if quarterback is good plus, not elite, but good to great, they're better than every team on their schedule, probably by a margin except for Georgia. I think Tennessee's going to suck this year, just as an aside. Even though I think that's the case, I still have them, like, I think 10-2 is the goal, with 11-1 being possible. Alabama's a playoff team, and with an easier schedule, I would be putting 11-1, 12-0 on the radar. Maybe not predicting it. I'm looking at this schedule and I'm saying 10-2, just because of sequencing and because it's a brutal stretch. But if they win that game at Georgia, they're going 11-1 or 12-0. That's my thought.
Yeah, look, I don't know. People said the same thing last year, and they lost to Vanderbilt the week after Georgia. The thing to me, Daniel, about this Alabama team is really twofold. One, from a coaching standpoint, Saban was the master of consistency. And, he was a defensive genius, which everyone admitted. He'd be the first one to tell you, as an in-game X and O's decision-making coach, he actually had some flaws. I've always said he was really bad at using timeouts, which was kind of weird for a guy with his reputation that always wanted to have control of timeouts. There were some other in-game decisions. Setting up the kick six was probably a really bad decision. Just situationally and whatnot with a kicker that hadn't kicked before. But what made him special was organizational structure, obviously, defensive smarts, but more than anything was creating a consistent football team year in and year out. Now, they stopped being dominant. I think, we talked about the lack of blowouts. I won't blame that on Milroe last year. I won't even blame it on DeBoer. They haven't blown teams out consistently really since 2020. There was a big flaw that we've talked about a lot between the two of us in the 2021-2022 years when they had, reasonably really good teams those years, those teams still weren't blowing teams out other than a couple times a year, where they usually would have like 3 close games or having 6 or 7. And I say all that to say, I don't know if DeBoer is going to be the kind of coach that can have the team play at that level on a consistent basis. He did not do it at Washington. Even when they were very good, they had a number of games where they played them out really flat and nearly lost. Didn't lose, but nearly lost. And to your point, Daniel, this is like you're saying, Tennessee may suck. Suck is a relative term. I mean, I think Tennessee is going to be a reasonably good team. I don't think they'll be nearly as good as they were last year, but I think they'll be a reasonably good team. That is a team you can lose to. Vanderbilt was just a merely reasonably good team last year, and they lost to them. Maybe not even reasonably good, but just okay to good. I defended Alabama a bit because Vanderbilt wasn't bad. They were probably a top 40 caliber quality team. It wasn't the jarring loss people made it out to be, that it was Vanderbilt when they were like 2-10, but they weren't great. So I don't take it for granted that this Alabama team is going to be consistent enough, to your point, with this defense and everything else, where if they beat Georgia, that they're going to go 11-1 or 10-2. They may drop a couple games. I think that is still an open question. But what I will say from a team evaluation standpoint, if you look at what wins championships, so to speak, historically they always said defense wins championships. The reason for that is, if you want to avoid dropping dumb games, the best way to do that is to have an excellent defense, because you're not going to end up in a situation where, the game of football being what it is, if a team gets hot, you give up 40 points. And that's just hard to consistently win like that, which is what Alabama experienced at Vanderbilt. I think this defense is going to be good enough to prevent that. So I think, I think 10-2, 11-1 is a realistic possibility. I lean towards 10-2 just because of the difficulty of the schedule they're facing. But 10-2 with this record is an absolute playoff team, and 10-2 with this record, even if it doesn't make the SEC title, is absolutely a team that can win the national title. It's just like everybody else. There's holes. And Daniel, I'll end with this for my part. I think it's kind of fascinating this year that when you look at the major teams from a top 25 perspective, they're pretty much all teams, or mostly teams, with new quarterbacks. Texas has a new quarterback. Ohio State has a new quarterback. Alabama has a new quarterback. Georgia has a new quarterback. Notre Dame has a new quarterback. Oregon has a new quarterback. Like, the top 8, the only teams in the coaches poll with returning starters are Clemson, who neither one of us is that high in Klubnik, and Penn State, and neither one of us is very high in Drew Aller. And so it is anybody's game. And when you take that into mind, again, I don't think Ty Simpson has to be the best quarterback on the face of the earth. And I think they've got, at least Keelan Russell, the freshman, gives them another option if they need it. They've got enough other pieces that I think they have every bit as good a shot as anybody else. I don't hate that they're number 8 because it feels like such a logjam. But I do think maybe to a certain degree they're being disrespected, because I think their roster overall is a good notch better than like Clemson or Oregon or, frankly, Penn State's, outside of the hype at the quarterback position and running back position for Penn State, certainly. This is an extremely talented roster with a lot of experience. And somehow, being Alabama, after one bad year, they're flying under the radar. It's a little crazy to me, Daniel.
It's kind of what you want, though. I'm going on record. I think Alabama goes 10-2 and is the best team in the country. I'm not picking them to win the national championship. I don't go that far in team previews. I think that Ty Simpson is going to be a great quarterback in this system for what they need. And I already have a lot of respect for that defense. And unlike Ohio State and Texas defenses that were better than Alabama's last year, they don't have as many guys coming back. And so I think that Alabama's defense is going to be absolutely legit. And Alabama isn't replacing a bunch of coordinators. The one thing that sticks in the back of my head is the thing that you mentioned, because I thought about that when we were saying we're going to do this preview today. He had some stinkers at Washington. He lost those games, or won those games that last year, but they should have been blowouts. And so I think that does stick in the back of my head a little bit. But I'm going to stick my neck out right here, and people can post this on Freezing Cold Takes as if it turns out to be false. But Alabama is going to shock people just in that everybody has written them off after the year they had last year. You lost to Vanderbilt, you lost to Oklahoma. I don't think anybody looked deep enough at what DeBoer walked into to understand. They're attributing it to him sucking and not ready for the big show, and not understanding it really has nothing to do with that. It has to do with all the other factors he walked into. But we'll see. All right, let us know what you think Alabama's record is going to be. Is it going to be better than what I said, worse than what I said? And do you think they've got the quarterback situation figured out? It's hard to say without a spring game and close practices, but just go on record like I did. Do some hypothetical love. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.